Order. We now begin public proceedings of the Education Select Committee. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all here today. Our meeting today is an accountability hearing on the work of Ofsted. And before I ask our witnesses today to introduce themselves, I'm going to invite members of the committee to just put on record any interest that they would like to declare. Manuela.
Yeah, as a former school governor, I had experience of Ofsted inspection in October 2021.
Rena.
As a former teacher and school leader, I also have had experience of a few Ofsted inspections.
As a former cabinet member at Southampton City Council, I have, I can't remember when or how many, but certainly a number of ILACs and other inspection experience.
As a teacher of 24 years and a school governor, 3 schools, I've had 9 Ofsted experiences.
And as a maths teacher, I've had Ofsted experiences too.
Thank you very much. So Martyn, can I ask you to introduce yourself and colleagues who are with you here today?
Yes, well, Happy New Year. I'm Martyn, the Chief Inspector at Ofsted.
My name's Yvette, Stanley, Ofsted's National Director for Early Years Regulation and Social Care. I joined Ofsted in 2018 after 30 years in children's services, and I stopped counting at about 100 Ofsted inspections.
Good morning, I'm Owston. I'm Ofsted's National Director for Education.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start our questioning this morning with some questions about Ofsted's response to the Ruth Perry Prevention of Future Deaths report. So Martyn, in your response to the Prevention of Future Deaths report following the inquest into the death of Ruth Perry, you said such tragedies should never happen again and no one should feel as Ruth did. Can you give the committee a brief introduction to the measures that you have taken to ensure that this is the case?
Yes, well, thank you. So on my beginning of my tenure on the 1st of January last year, my immediate reaction was to, first of all, meet with Ruth's sister and representatives of the family and of the school, and then I responded in full, accepting all of the recommendations from the coroner, and then went subsequently on to publish that response. And I've got quite a detailed response to the actions we've taken that I placed online. I think it's around about March last year, but I can go through very briefly some of those actions against some of the areas. So the coroner made 7 clear recommendations. I think the 7th was more directed at the Department of Education, but on the 6 areas, just in brief, and I can go into as much detail as you want, Chair, but obviously I don't want to repeat what's been online for the best part of a year anyway. The first of the queries that the coroner raised was about 2 hypothetical schools, School A and School B, with School A being good in all aspects but failing in safeguarding, and then a school which has got systemic failing across the board, and both being judged as, under a single word judgment, inadequate. So my predecessor had already put in place changes prior to the inquest about going back quickly to return to schools and inspect them. We then made changes immediately around the response, but then subsequently since then, we made a commitment to look again at how we deal with those schools. So in September, I charged Lee with updating the handbook on our inspections so that should we get to a school now which is good in all aspects, but it has safeguarding concerns, and we are confident as an inspectorate that school has the capacity to deal with those safeguarding concerns, we can suspend, pause the inspection, monitor that school for up to and no longer than 3 months, keeping an enduring relationship with it, and then return and complete the inspection. Now, I was assured that that was a wise decision to take because it takes roughly around 3 months to produce an inadequate report. So having an enduring relationship with a school that we're confident has the capacity to deal with those concerns, we were confident that the schools are tackling those safeguarding concerns immediately, instantly, rather than waiting months for the report to appear. We did put some safeguards in place to make sure that the Department for Education were aware of the suspend and return, to make sure that the local authority and their Children's Safeguarding Board were aware of it, and to insist that the school communicated to parents that we had suspended our inspection. That way, everyone openly and transparently knew it was taking place. Now, we anticipated we wouldn't use that at all or no more than less than one handful of times a year. Since September, we have one current case where we have suspended and paused it. And if I look at that case and I think about that school without naming it, it was a wise decision. I'll give you an example of that school, if I may. It's a school, I shan't describe the school too closely, so we'll identify it, but it was a new leadership team who were clearly turning around the school. It was clear from our evidence that they had the capacity. It was clearly good in all aspects, but it was dealing with an historical backlog of safeguarding issues that it had recognised, it knew what it was doing, it knew how to clear them all, it just hadn't cleared all of them. And it gives us concern that they're not cleared, but we have confidence in that leadership. So we now have a relationship with that school, and we expect to return to it imminently later this month. And I would expect, from the work we've done in monitoring them, that school will get good in safeguarding and therefore be good overall. So I think that was a really positive recommendation, that we took action prior to the coroner, around the coroner, and subsequently further again. And I think that's a sensible thing to do, and we're still maintaining standards, because safeguarding is not an administrative task. It's a serious undertaking. It's a serious duty on providers, and I think that's a sensible response. So that's the first of those. Shall I carry on?
Yeah.
The second one, try to be a little quicker, is an almost complete absence of training or published policy in signs of distress and how to deal with distress. Well, when I started in January, I immediately paused inspections, and I then placed our training, worked with an external agency called Mental Health First Aid England. So we had independent expertise who subsequently have actually joined one of our external reference groups to continue to challenge us, along with other professionals that are well known in the system, like Sinead McBrearty, who supports education leaders. We put in place training for all of our inspectors, and I wouldn't allow any of our inspectors to start inspecting until they'd been through that training, and I committed that every inspector would go through that by March, and that was completed. So every inspector has gone through training. All of our requirements now require this to be a part of their core training. I've built it into work, which I'm sure I'll get onto later, in our Ofsted Academy, which is continuously developing the training of inspectors. And we can now have a whole series of raft of measures. So alongside the training, we have a provider helpline where providers can call rather than speak to the inspection team, because we recognise, and our independent report from Dame Christine Gilbert, which no doubt we'll come on to later, she talked about a power imbalance and recognising the power imbalance between the inspectorate and those being inspected. So rather than just raising a concern from the school to the inspector, which can sometimes be difficult, we now have an independent senior member of staff that the school can contact during an inspection, and a whole host of other measures that we've put in place. But really, and hopefully we'll come on to this also later, those sorts of changes, whilst they're responses to this, in order to make systemic changes, alongside the seismic changes I made last year, there are more seismic changes to come this year, and the changes I'm proposing to make this year will further reduce the pressure and the way that we go about our inspection methodology, which will be more proportionate, fairer, because I do know that in a high-performing system, high accountability is a core part of this, but we've got to do it in a way which is proportionate, fair, transparent, and I think our proposals can deliver all this and raise standards at the same time. There's more I can say on that, but for brevity, I'll keep on going if that's okay, Chair. The third is an absence of a clear path to raise concerns during the inspection if these can't be resolved directly with the lead inspector. Again, we have now provider helplines in the centre. I've created a series of hubs. My predecessors made some very clever decisions. Go back 2 predecessors. They decided to regionalise Ofsted and create 8 regions, which are coterminous with the government's regions, which is a wise thing to do. But I noticed on joining Ofsted that a lot of our work fell into very regional ways of working, and I was worried that we were getting a fracture between regional variation and consistency in our practice. So I've put in place during the last year a series of central hubs which look at one Ofsted across the whole of England, central control. So we have a central hub now that looks at complaints and provider concerns during an inspection to make sure we're consistent in the way that we're managing all of those. We've also improved the way that people can raise complaints to our independent complaints adjudicator, ICASO, that we've been working with for a number of years. And you can raise those complaints earlier and quicker now. And then lastly on that one, we've even introduced an external reference group to look at complaints, and we invite random and alternate external references. So recently, Lee, we had trade union representatives on a complaints panel, and we took a sample of complaints. Do you want to just quickly talk about that?
I chaired our external complaints panel as a trial. So we invited trade union representation, head teachers not associated with the examples of complaints that we shared. This is all to be more transparent in the processes that we undertake when a provider complains. And overwhelmingly, the feedback from those trial external complaints panels was positive. And on that basis, we're looking to roll out almost monthly from this month those panels, so that I or Yvette or our delegates can host those events and show people, through using live cases that have closed, exactly the detail that we go through, and not taking for granted what people have put forward as part of their complaint, but rigorously going through the evidence and then formulating a response.
But I was really heartened when external people are joining that panel and saying that they were quite taken aback by the sheer level of detail that we go into checking our consistency in the complaints. And again, without taking too long in the 2-hour session, I've even introduced steps to make sure that if we have complaints, that a totally separate inspection team from a totally separate region comes in to inspect the school, so we can further demonstrate independence and openness and transparency in the way we work. So we've done an awful lot on that one. The next one was regarding the confidentiality requirement after an inspection. Well, my predecessor made changes to really clarify upon that immediately, even before the inquest took place. So we've made it absolutely rock solid clear that people can contact whoever they need, whether it's their support network, a health professional, other people in the school, governing bodies. It's really writ large and clear in our handbook from now on going forward. So we made that change last year. And again, next year, we've got some thoughts about how we can improve upon that in methodology. And as you know, Chair, when we met prior to Christmas, I'll do my best to talk about the proposed plan, but it's not yet live on public. And I'll tell this committee as much as I can. But as I said to you then, I'm also happy to come back when we do go live with that report and answer questions on that in more detail, should I not be able to answer any today. The next one was timescales for report publication. We'd already committed to making sure that reports are out in 30 days. We track that now, 30 working days. 95% of school reports hit the 30 working day report. 2% of them fall outside because we're gathering additional evidence or doing evidence-based reviews for more complex reasons, or we're dealing with a complaint about the inspection and we're going through that before we publish. And then there are 3% that have fallen late. But even those that fall late might be because we fall on either side of a term and we don't publish during holidays, because that's not fair for the workload of people who are receiving the reports to work during a holiday. And sometimes that might delay the day which we miss by, but we don't have many which miss out of the date of publication. And then the next one was no learning review of these matters. And the way the comment had written it, I presumed that the comment had meant there's no learning review of those 5 points. Well, not only did I commit to a learning review, but I thought better to do an independent learning review. So alongside the big listen that I talked about to this committee, the predecessor committee on my appointment, that I conducted in March, I conducted with the chair, we appointed an independent expert to lead a learning review of the way that Ofsted worked to Caversham, and that work was undertaken by Dame Christine Gilbert. And we learnt a lot from her report, which is a challenging report for us to read, but nonetheless very useful in helping us think about the responses that we made. And then the very last one was about the Secretary of State and support for school leaders. I think that was mostly aimed at the Department for Education, but we're doing what we can. So with our external reference group, we have an external reference group focused entirely on provider well-being, and we're looking at signposting to leaders where they can get support. When we phone a school and notify them of an inspection, we make sure we know who is the responsible body, who looks after the leader, who can support and guide them. And so we're doing all we can on that matter, but without crossing the line, because of course it is the responsible body's job to look after the providers and not ours. So we took it seriously. I took it very seriously. We responded in full. We've completed all of those actions. But even then, I know that they're not enough and further reform is needed beyond what I did last year, and that will come via a new framework which we're proposing later this month.
Thank you. Can I just press a bit on the individuals who were involved directly, either directly in the inspection of Caversham Primary School or in overseeing that process and that inspection. What action have you taken to review the actions of those individuals, and what is the relationship between those actions, that kind of very personal accountability for the people who were directly involved in that process and in overseeing that process, and the wider issue of culture change that's needed at Ofsted? And how are you? What action have you taken to make sure that there is accountability at that level, and that those actions are really contributing to? You've got the same people working in the organisation. How are you ensuring that there is culture change?
Yeah, so a big part of the culture change, well, culture comes from leadership, and so I'm making sure that we're focusing on all of our inspections being delivered with professionalism, courtesy, empathy and respect. And I'm really heartened that I've heard lots of feedback from the system on how they've seen that's made a difference in the last 12 months to inspection, and yet we've still maintained strong accountability because the percentage of good and outstanding hasn't changed since I've taken over in charge of Ofsted. So it's about changing the culture in from the top and being quite clear about all of the systems that some of which I've described about how people go about working. Regarding the actual individual inspectors, there was one HMI that undertook the inspection and 2 Ofsted inspectors. One of those Ofsted inspectors was on a training and no longer works for Ofsted. Another one hasn't been deployed at this moment, but could be deployed at a later date. And the other HMI has not resumed on any inspection. But there were, again, in the public committee, this person carried out an inspection against the framework in the way that the framework was written. There was no suggestion that they did a bad job or did anything wrong whatsoever. It was the framework that they delivered, and it's for Ofsted to respond. It's Ofsted's responsibility, not the responsibility of that individual. And I have a duty to that individual to protect them and their well-being, because they have quite some considerable concerns in their work. So I'm supporting that individual in their employment of Ofsted, but I'm not placing them out on inspection because they're vulnerable, and I need to make sure I support that member of staff as well.
And so I just want to press you a little bit more. So it is, because it is difficult for organisations faced with the scale of challenge and the scale of change that is needed, sometimes to see what is wanting when there is a prevailing culture within the organisation within which everybody has already been working. So I understand that you've got a duty of care to employees in Ofsted, as you have to the schools and the organisations that you're inspecting. But are you absolutely confident that that culture change is taking place, and that you haven't got, for want of a better word, an old guard of inspectors who really don't see quite what the problem is?
No, I'm absolutely confident in that case. The HMIs, His Majesty's inspectors, or the social care regulatory inspectors, or the early years regulatory inspectors, the cadre of inspectors who are employed by Ofsted are expert professionals who are doing this day in, day out. And they, because of the changes, and again, it's difficult to explain in isolation to any one question, but whether it's the Ofsted Academy that we've put in place, and that, what do I mean by that? Well, a few minutes ago I described that we have regions, and training took place in regions. And whilst Yvette is in charge, and the National Director for anything to do with children's services and social care would direct the training, it was delivered by the region. Lee, the same for education, delivered by the region. And I detected it led to some regional variance. Sometimes they would deliver the message with complete fidelity, and sometimes they would put their own regional spin onto it to try and make it fit their region, their people. But we're a national organisation, and if you come up against people like me in my old job, where I had 3 regions that my organisation covered, you could tell the difference between one region sometimes and another region. So we needed to work nationally. So the Ofsted Academy now covers all 8 regions, and it makes sure that the training delivered from Yvette and Lee is delivered with fidelity. So I can be sure that our full-time employed staff are getting the message, and they're getting the message every week. Going from training once or twice a year to weekly training because of the way that we deploy and notify inspections on Mondays, and I can talk about that if once further on, all of that makes a difference because I can now get training happening all the time, and that's where the culture change is coming, along with the national hubs, Again, stopping having conversations happening at regional level, but having national consistency hubs checking on how we do all of these things. That's delivering the change. But then again, it's perhaps worth knowing that the vast majority of Ofsted's workforce are not employed by Ofsted. They're contracted because they work in early years settings, in schools, colleges. They're out there in the system. The vast majority, thousands of our staff, are actually employed working in schools right now. And my ambition is to make sure we become even more of a peer-led review system of the system, but by the system for parents and children in raising standards. And that figure, for all of the issues and all of the serious challenges that we've had, we have thousands, and I mean thousands of people that want to become Ofsted inspectors. I think in just a period of November to December, we had something like 1,500 people make a request to become an Ofsted inspector. People want to work with us because they can see the value of our organisation if we work proportionately with sensitivity in holding the system to account. The vast majority of people in the system want to be held accountable. They just want it to be done fairly.
Thank you. You've talked about the 6 national hubs, and one of those national hubs will be a complaints against Ofsted hub, and they will be led by regional directors. Can I ask why you have been resistant to a fully independent complaints process? So we see across a pattern of different organisations in different sectors that have hit up against really significant problems, have resisted putting in place a truly independent complaints process, essentially giving their own homework more marks than it deserves. And you've talked about consistency, but that is different to what the kind of prevailing standard is that is used to assess complaints. And independence is important for that reason, but it is also important, as many other organisations, that we look at the Church of England this week, which has been in exactly that situation of resisting, failing to put in place independence in their complaints process, and ultimately running into really big problems. And you have got a problem because of the Caversham inspection and other examples that have arisen of trust and confidence of the profession. Independence in the complaints process can be really important in establishing and rebuilding trust and confidence. Why is it that you've chosen to run with a process which is internally held and managed, albeit that it has some components to it that sit outside the organisation?
Yeah, so it is a challenge. So first of all, Ofsted for a long time, I don't know the date, but I can get you it exactly, has worked with an independent complaints adjudicator, ICASO, where people can make a complaint to ICASO, entirely independent of us, and I get a report from them making sure that have we gone through our complaints procedure, have we taken this seriously, have we fulfilled our duty to go through that. And every time that they receive a report, they write back to me and saying that either we've found that you have adhered to your complaints procedure or you failed your complaints procedure, and we have to undertake a learning review of any failings that we make against that. So we do have and have had ICASO existing for quite some time now as an entirely independent organisation. Then in terms of inspection, well, that becomes really difficult because who inspects the inspectorate and who inspects the inspectorate of the inspectorate, and where does it ever end? We undertake evidence, we inspect with evidence, we gather the evidence, and then we review it. And this complaints against Ofsted hub that we talked about nationally, the one you refer to, has a panel of experts now, not just local regional people who are occasionally doing it, but now it's a national panel. I've got trained experts from across the country who now form a part of this hub, and they're checking the evidence against the handbook that either Yvette or Lee's written to make sure it's been delivered and make sure that we can gather and judge the evidence. And then we do quite a lot of gathering additional evidence or evidence-based reviews, some EBRs or GAEs, we call them in Ofsted, against our work, and we're doing them increasingly, so we're challenging ourselves all the time. How do you then not say, well, why do you get somebody independent to do that? Well, because somebody will have to go back and inspect the school, because it's a point-in-time inspection. The evidence was gathered at that point, and that's the evidence that was found. You couldn't make a judgment unless you sent a separate team, another version of Ofsted, back into that school to undertake that evidence again, because it would only be relying upon the evidence that we found. So basically, you're committing the school to a whole brand new, or the early years childminder or the children's home, to a complete other separate inspection. So it has to be about us finding the evidence, gathering the evidence, and then making sure that that evidence meets the framework. Now, going forward, I think there are ways to try and break that fourth wall. And so we've learnt a lot from different types of inspection. I mean, one of the things that I can say today about our consultation, that we have right now the EIF, the Evidence Inspection Framework, which covers all of education. And then we have a Social Care Common Inspection Framework and an ILACS inspection that you mentioned, Darren, that covers children's services and social care. But the EIF covers everything from the early years, childminders, nurseries, schools. It's one common framework across. And I think we've discovered from our big listen and from our work that we need frameworks that are more representative of the areas in which we expect. So we should be consulting on an early years framework, which will work for both childminders and for groups delivering early years. We'll consult on an education schools, skills, an independent and initial teacher education framework. So there's nuance in that. And one of the things that we learned in further education frameworks is we often have a nominee. So we ask someone who's in the college, often because they're very large organisations, to come and join and be a regular part of the Ofsted inspection. And it breaks that difference between being done to and done with. And we think that there's something in that, so we're proposing to consult on whether we think that's a good idea going forward, again, to just increase that transparency.
Thank you. I'm going to move on because of time at this point, but I would just ask really quickly, if I may, are you committed, having established this new process and the new hub, to continually reviewing the relationship between that process and the trust and confidence in your organisation, in the profession, and to making further changes in the future if needed? Absolutely,
which is why we then take a sample of the work of that hub and then take it to the group that Lee mentioned a few moments ago. We invite system leaders, trade union representatives to come and then look at the work, look at the complaint, look at how we've handled the complaints, look at our complaints process, and then to check that we've actually adhered and it was a fair process. And that's the one that we took, great feedback from people saying they couldn't believe the lengths that we went to. So we are committed to being open and transparent. And we're even thinking about the way we gather evidence and how we make that open and transparent. So again, what we don't want is anything to be kept secret. But of course, some aspects of our work deal with often very challenging whistleblowing or safeguarding concerns where we do have to keep things separately aside for the protection of either a child or a member of staff that might be abused. So we are very committed to being open and transparent in that and keeping a review of the way that we work on complaints. It's an area we take seriously. Thank you. I'll go to Manuela next.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Martyn, you touch upon timescale for publication of reports. So in response to the coroner's report, Ofsted said that it would use the big listen to consult school leaders and parents on the length of time it takes to publish an inspection report. But there was no mention of this issue in the big listen questionnaire. So why was this omitted, and what consultations have you had with schools and parents on the current time scale between inspection and publishing of reports?
So thank you. On a slightly separate, I shall definitely answer the question. We did ask the big listen about the timescale and notice for going in and inspecting, but on the timescale of reports, a lot of that's down to our resource and our capacity. We committed to 30 days, so we tried to get all of our reports out within 30 working days. We can't go a great deal faster than that, not just because of capacity, but because we seriously undertake consistency training. So every Friday, for example, last thing on a Friday, I will sit on a group, which either Lee or Yvette run, where we look at all the reports that have come in that week from across the country, and we're doing hundreds. and we look at the most controversial reports or ones where inadequate judgments might be given or they're high profile, or from risk assessment, the outcome might be different to the one that you might presume. You don't go in with a fixed view on inspection, but if you've got data which is very, very, very bad and you get a very, very good report, then you just want to ask yourself, what was the evidence that was found on inspection? So we will then check that every week. So we have to run through those processes to make sure that we're consistent and we're doing a good job. We think we can get those reports out in 30 days or less. And that's what I said. We've got 95% of our inspections do hit that deadline. We have 2% that fall outside of that deadline because we get a complaint about the inspection, which then we have to take that seriously and won't publish it until we get to that end point. And we have 3% where we've missed our deadline, and that's for all sorts of reasons, whether that's our fault, in which case we've just been tardy and we've got a mistake there which we've got to get better at, or it's because it's fallen at the end of one half term or one term and we're reporting at the back end of another and we've just missed a day or so in reporting. But 30 days we think is reasonable. Now, again, remembering that's 30 days to publication, but that's not 30 days for the school to see the report. If we're talking about a school, they might get the report in the draft format within a week. So we are faster now at how we make sure that they see that report. It is definitely regarding, in the case of Caversham, when we've got concerns about the report, that it just got delayed and then delayed and then delayed again, and it pushed it back to an unacceptable length of time. But we've got checks and balances now to make sure we're watching that, so we don't have leaders who are sitting there with a report that's just hanging over them and it's not going out in public.
We'll go to Serena.
Thank you, Chair. Dame Christine Gilbert's first recommendation is that Ofsted should continue to address the coroner's concerns and this committee's recommendations with a sense of urgency. Are you confident that you've addressed each of the coroner's concerns and each recommendation made by this committee in its Ofsted report?
Thank you. I am confident that we've addressed the concerns to the best of our ability against the framework that we have. And it's a good framework that's well respected on the whole by the system, and there is much that we want to endure going forward. But I think a more nuanced framework which better talks to the difference between a childminder who might be someone who has 2 children in their front room to a nursery with 100 or so children in it, to a single form entry primary school, to a secondary like the one I used to be the head teacher of with 2,200 children in it, to an FE college which might have thousands and thousands of learners, to a training provider which might have 5 or 6 doing an apprenticeship. I think when we've got a framework which has that nuance, which we've built the methodology and the lessons that you're referring to from this committee and from Dame Christine Gilbert's and the Preventing Future Death into our building of the framework, I think that methodology, the new framework, will deliver a more proportionate, more respectful system and yet still raise standards. Because Ofsted has an important role for parents to hold the system to account and to raise standards across the system. And I think we can do this and hopefully our consultation later this month will demonstrate to people that it can be achieved.
Okay, so how will you measure the success of the changes that you've implemented?
Well, so I've been measuring them, whether it's anecdotally and feedback or talking to system leaders or by looking at how we take feedback. So every time we undertake an inspection, we ask for people to provide feedback on inspections. It's been a figure that people haven't trusted in the past, but it's one that is completed by a significant number of inspections. We do about between 15 and 20,000 inspections a year. We'll do 500 next week, for example. About half of the people we undertake will reply to their post-inspection survey and tell us how it's gone. Well, those figures have returned back to the levels around pre-pandemic already because of the changes that we've made. And I'm in a really very difficult scenario right now where I've been told that urgent reform was required, and I've worked at absolute breakneck speed for the last 12 months to make the change. And then I've been told that the changes by some have had massive impact and that therefore I now don't need to rush any further change. And by others, I'm told that I still need to carry on with the pace of change. So I'm not sure in the world of politicians, if I've got one half saying you're going too fast and one half saying you're going too slow, I have to think I'm probably about right.
Okay, so how will you communicate the successes with stakeholders? And are there proposed timescales for this?
Yeah, so one of the areas that we made clear was to then take from Dame Christine Gilbert's review. She was concerned that of all the actions, whether it's the coroner's report, this predecessor committee's report, whether it's the big listen, that it needed to be open and transparent in one simple place. So we took all of the actions from everything and we made them into 132 actions. And we've completed a significant number of those, and we've actually made those public now. So we had a board meeting in December where we approved my chair of my board approved it, and then in December we published our Big Listen Action Monitoring Report, where we now tell everyone the progress we're making against the Preventing Future Deaths, this committee and the Big Listen as we're going forward. And most people will see the vast majority of changes will come via the new methodology and the new framework. That will see the vast majority of the 132 then in action. Then, being held accountable by our board, open and transparent board, and the committee will know that a long-standing chair who's in her second term has decided to step down and will soon be advertising for a new chair of the board, and I'm sure that person will want to make sure that we're again challenging us and holding us openly and transparently to account, and we can think about the way that the board then works going forward, and also the way that we then show all of our data. So I want to be clear that we have clear key performance metrics that we can then share in our annual report and accounts, and then in our annual review, which is laid in front of Parliament every single year. So I expect both of those documents to be useful. And then, of course, now with the election delaying me coming here, then hopefully I'll be back into a regular rhythm of coming here and being held accountable by you on those actions, and you'll be able to clearly see the progress that I make or do not.
I look forward to that in about 6 months'
So
time.
am I.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Sir Martyn. The alternative Big Listen, which ran at the same time as Ofsted's consultation, found that 91% of respondents do not consider Ofsted to be fit for purpose. We've obviously spent a lot of this hearing talking about the sad case of Ruth Perry, but is there anything else that you think is driving this underlying distrust between within the sector of Ofsted?
Thank you. I think there was a series of changes historically that have been made that my predecessor spoke really well about, which have led to this being a really difficult moment in time. So, without going on too long, let's look. We had an historical abeyance of outstanding school inspections that were put in place. And that meant that since that came along, that every school that was outstanding sat on that judgment for an awful long time. And when I was a head teacher, I got outstanding in 2012, and it wasn't inspected until last year. So nearly 12 years before that school gets inspected again. It's a similar case, I think, with Caversham, which had been an outstanding school and then not inspected for an awful long time. So one, you're a head teacher sitting on an outstanding judgment, or a new head teacher inheriting an outstanding judgment. There's a lot of pressure on you. And you've not experienced Ofsted inspections, you've not experienced that regular scrutiny, and then it comes along. And if you then don't maintain your outstanding, there's a very good chance that people would put a complaint in against Ofsted. So now you've got the outstanding people who might be complaining about Ofsted. You've then got the usual, which we regularly get complaints when we hold people accountable and say they're inadequate. They often complain. We get people who are requiring improvement, who are complaining because previously, until it has been recently dropped, if your school had 2 requiring improvement judgments, it was subject to a potential termination warning notice as accountability. Some of our 4 judgments, outstanding, good, requiring improvement and inadequate, 3 of them suddenly had a level of accountability which was really, really high. And whether it was disproportionate or not, well, the current government have a view on that. And so it meant there was an awful lot of challenge. There was an awful lot happening on the back of an Ofsted inspection. I do like to remind people that in terms of Ofsted, what happens if you get an inadequate judgment is we will just turn up and monitor you more regularly. We are not the regulator of schools, we're the inspectorate. We regulate early years, we regulate in children's services and social care, but in schools the Department for Education is the regulator. It's the regulator who uses the Ofsted judgment and then decides it will take action on the back of that from an accountability, and that's where a lot of the pressure and stress comes from. I think it's entirely right, and it should be a requirement, that we need a coherent accountability system, which is the inspectorate and the regulator being clear. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the Department of Education's work with its RISE teams and the work it has going forward. But again, I think our methodology will deliver higher and rising standards. I think moving the single word judgment, as simple a judgment as it is, low information and high stakes is the position. I think we can move to high information and more proportionate stakes and still raise accountability and still tell parents very clearly the performance of schools, and that's what I hope to consult on.
Just to follow up quickly on that, your differentiation between a regulation and an inspector kind of skewed my second question, but can you take this moment now and this opportunity to explain how important Ofsted is, an inspectorate is, a regulator is for the quality of education in this country and the long-term outcomes for children in schools in this country?
Oh, thank you. Well, our work is vital. Now, many people who are completing alternative big listens or going onto social media, they might deliver a good education and good services, and they might feel that it's an unnecessary burden to have Ofsted come along and inspect them because they're good people doing good work. It's difficult in education. I mean, in 30 years, and I've had nearly 100 Ofsted inspections as a head teacher and a senior leader in my time. You know, you've got people trying their level best, foster carers trying their level best, people looking after children's homes trying their level best. It's really hard to be told when you're trying your best in difficult circumstances that you're not doing a good enough job. And so clearly it's very emotive, but our role is essential, because what people don't see, and what even I, for all the experience that I had in the system until I took this job, when you get to see a child in secure accommodation who's sleeping on a dirty mattress on the floor with a broken sink and a broken window, when you see footage of an illegal school, when you see the conditions of children working in them, when you go into a maintained school and you see complete fracture between the local authority and the governing body and the leaders in the community, and children getting an awful deal, when you go into a secondary school that's an academy and you see the head teacher of the academy and the trust in complete loggerheads with each other, and children having an appalling time, the acceptable standards of education. When you see all of those things, you realise the importance of our work. But then you also realise the importance of our work by our very presence. The very fact that we exist, the fact that we have a framework, the fact that we say to people, these are the standards in education, children's services and skills which you must adhere to, and it's unacceptable for children to have, or young people or adults that we're in apprenticeships, to experience education, children's services or skills of a lesser value. You then see the importance of our work. And it's vital. High-performing systems have high levels of accountability. I think, though, that we can do this in a way which is fairer, more transparent, and more proportionate, and more supportive. And I think that's what I will hopefully consult on with the help of Lee for education, and then later, probably aiming for April 26, and there are good reasons for that, in children's services, we can do the same, and I think we can still raise standards across the board. But thank you, it's a vital role we carry out.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your answers so far. I particularly appreciate your last answer to Patrick about the purpose of Ofsted and why we do it. Just to follow up, though, on something that Patrick was asking about, he talked about the fact that 91% of respondents said that Ofsted wasn't fit for purpose. And in your response, you talked about the level of scrutiny that comes with 3 of those 4-word Ofsted judgments. Is it primarily down to that? Is that why 91% of people say it's not fit for purpose?
No. And 91% of people, I had no idea about the alternative big listen. They never bothered to share or write to me or tell me any of their findings. I've no idea of the methodology, the number of people. I know from our research that we had over 30,000 people, independent research that took place, which is nationally representative, verified, all made public and transparent, that we have different levels of trust in the system. Now, it's really interesting. In Yvette's work, where in children's services, we have some of the worst outcomes following inspections. We have more local authorities that are inadequate or inconsistent in their ascend or requiring improvement under ILAC's inspections or the Social Care Common Inspection Framework, and yet they have the greatest level of trust in the judgments that we make. And then you go into further education, where we have quite a high number of good and outstanding performers. They have relatively high levels of trust. It's then less in early years and even less in schools. And you have to look at all of the additional things that come alongside it, whether it's the regulatory accountability on termination, which has already been dropped because of the double RI standard and the proposals which might come forward from the RISE teams going forward on inadequate and judgments that we might make going forward in the future. Or it's the transparency and the way that the framework works. So, for example, at the moment, the framework, it describes a good school. Then, if you're not a good school, you might be outstanding. So you meet all the good requirements and there's some elements of outstanding. If you're neither of those, the next conversation is, well, let's look at inadequate, because there is no criteria for requiring improvement. So if you're a head teacher and you're sitting in your school and you're thinking you're running a good school, but the inspectorate's like, well, you've got some judgments here, but it might not be good. Right, let's turn now to inadequate. Well, can you imagine your heart rate as a head teacher now? What do you mean inadequate? Where's this come from? Now you're discussing the inadequate criteria. Right, it's not inadequate, therefore it's absent, it's neither one nor the other, it therefore must require improvement and be the blank one. I don't think that's clear enough. I think that's opaque. I think we need to find a way to make sure that leaders themselves can say, can I clearly see whether I'm doing what I need to do? And the standards in which we work, I've also been really clear. I said this, I think, to the predecessor committee on my appointment. I was really concerned as the chief inspector. I'm not saying my predecessors have ever done this at all, but I was concerned that I couldn't be held accused of coming into the role and just imposing my whims on the system, thinking that there are 95,000 people that we inspect and regulate. I didn't want them to be just on what I thought was the latest thing that Martyn Oliver thinks should happen to all of them. So the big listen was a big part of finding that out, but also making sure, I said, that how we inspect and what we should inspect should be a part of the system. So if I look at the statutory guidance of the Department for Education on attendance, for example, or the non-statutory guidance on behaviour, or I look at the teachers' professional standards, or you look at keeping children safe in education, or the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice, a legal requirement. If I just named just a few of those documents and I then said to Lee, I want you to write a framework which tells leaders out there, this is your statutory, non-statutory, your legal duty. I want you to hold people account for doing what they're supposed to do. And that's what Lee's written for me, and that's what I'm going to consult on. People will see a very proportionate that says to them, this is your job, this is what you're expected to do. It's not going to denude your flexibility as an individual to run a different schools. I think we should celebrate difference. But it will also not overstep, and it won't create a burden. I think it's all of those changes. That they'll address some of the questions about culture, they'll address concerns about consistency, they'll address concerns about workload. It's bringing it all across in a new way of working that still raises standards. This will be, I think the Secretary of State wrote to head teachers on the very beginning of September when she said that she's going to remove the single word judgment in schools. And there's a reason why, it won't prattle on too long, I'll let you ask questions. There's a reason why it was schools only first. And she said quite clearly in this letter to head teachers, but be clear, this won't be a soft option. There will still be high levels of accountability, but it will be more nuanced and lean into the complexity, but present it, I hope, in a way where parents can make real quick determinations about the quality of provision for their child, which is ultimately Ofsted's job.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in there the big listen. I'm just going to turn back to that because I know Patrick referenced it as well. It's run into some criticism. Some people have said that it asked too many leading questions, and some have even suggested that it was wrong not to ask people directly about their opinions about one-word Ofsted judgments. So how were the questions selected for the big listen, and do you think the criticism about the one-word Ofsted judgment questions is fair?
Again, I want to work openly and transparently, and that's why I decided to launch this was me. I decided to do the big listen. No one told me I had to do the big listen. I chose to go out and do a public consultation. Ofsted is an independent organisation. But I think it's really clear that I try and clear what do I mean and what does the law mean about the independence of Ofsted. We are independent of government, held accountable directly to Parliament via this committee, not to the Secretary of State in the Department for Education, because we can't be told by the Secretary of State or by any of you what we should find when we go and inspect somewhere. We will write the framework, we will go and inspect, and we will find a judgment. The Secretary of State can request and demand that I go and inspect somewhere, but she can't tell me what I shall find when I go there. Ofsted's independence is rooted in the evidence that we find. And one of my very long-serving, old-standing predecessors, David Bell, I think, said that. Our independence is in the evidence that we find. And that part is utterly crucial. Now, in the Big Listen, we wrote questions, but we are not completely, because although I am a Crown appointment and not a civil servant, everybody else who's an employee, or everyone here, everyone behind me, everyone else in Ofsted is a civil servant, and we're a non-departmental public body. We must not thwart the policy of government. So in the case of schools, we couldn't drop the single word judgment because the school system, the government, had interventions based upon the single word judgment. It would have been completely irresponsible of a non-departmental public body to say, despite the DfE having the systems in place for terminating schools if they're inadequate or with special measures requiring significant improvement or requires improvement, that I'm going to change that grade. It would place across the government, the Department of Education, into disarray. So once the Secretary of State decided to remove that judgment, we could remove that judgment because we're working in tandem. That's not being independent. Our independence, we will still find what we find on the ground. So here's the other example then. So in early years, we couldn't remove the single word judgment because, for example, now in a totally different department of government, you get child tax care credits if you send your child to a good or outstanding provider. It requires that unpicking of the child tax care credits into a new way of working without the single word judgment before we can drop it. In further education, the contract to deliver training is based upon being good or outstanding. If we then just unilaterally drop that, would have placed the FE skills sector into complete disarray. So we can't ask questions that are thwarting government policy. But we opened text boxes. There were open text boxes against every single question, and I suppose in a way, I do find it amusing. People saying that you didn't ask a single question about the one-word Big Listen, but look at the Big Listen response. The one-word judgment is heavily criticised. It came through loud and clear, and we reported on it. So we didn't ask it because it would have been completely irresponsible of us to do so with the government at the time, and yet the answer we got was people have a problem with the one-word judgment. Which, of course, fortuitously, the moment that came out, it also happened that a general election had taken place. A government came in with a manifesto to remove that judgment, and fortunately, I suppose, for the government, the findings of the Big Listen backed up the decision to remove the one-word judgment because even parents themselves said they found it not to be as appropriate as they wanted it in describing their child's school or early years setting. So I would refute that it wasn't an open, transparent process, and the very fact that we did it was a demonstration of being open and transparent in the first place.
Okay, I do have follow-ups, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thanks, Mark. Serena.
Thank you. Single word judgments in schools are to be replaced from September with school report cards. Can you tell us how these report cards will be developed and what consultation work will be undertaken?
So I'll do my best to describe this without fettering my future consultation, which is later this month, that I'm hoping to release that. And as I said, I apologise if that's an unacceptable answer, but I will be very happy to return and take scrutiny on that consultation. We will undertake a government consultation. We'll make sure that we meet not a minimum but a proper standard of government consultation, for example, a 12-week consultation period. It won't be a fait accompli. We shall present information to the system which talks from early year across education, so not children's services and social care. That will come later. For April 26 is my best guess at the moment with Yvette. This is just education, the work of Lee. So from early years through to further education, through to initial teacher training, education, independent schools and so on. It will present a proposed model for each of those areas. It will ask questions about those proposals, whether people think that the way of reporting is clear, and we will make a very special effort not to just hear from providers, but to hear from children and to hear from parents. So Lee and I will be flat out from the end of this month through to March, up and down the country, just talking to as many groups as possible about that work. There was clearly, what can I tell you now? We want to move from low information and high accountability to high quality information with proportionate accountability. Now, I think the biggest challenge is how do you take into context the work of schools and settings. Now, I chose to work in the vast majority of my 30 years in schools in really difficult circumstances, with very high levels of pupil premium and special educational needs and areas that were described or could be described as left behind, and disadvantaged children, vulnerable children, and so on and so forth. You want to make sure that you don't have a postcode lottery where you're accepting lower standards for children because of where they go to school or where they go to an early years setting. So you have to have high stakes there. You have to have high levels of accountability, but you want to recognise that people are doing difficult work. I promise I'll come back to it, but just for a second, Yvette and I went to I know I'm flipping to children's social care here, but we went to a children's home conference, and Yvette and I were sat on the stage, and we were facing questions from the audience, and they were telling us that in some children's homes they were avoiding taking the most vulnerable children because they didn't want Ofsted to come along and make them inadequate. Well, to us, that's just heartbreaking and utter nonsense. Ofsted should want providers to take the most vulnerable children, and we should recognise where they take the most vulnerable children, and we should proportionately hold them to account. We shouldn't expect them to have lower standards, but neither should we create a system where they just avoid having them in the first place and off-roll them or refuse to take them. So that was a really upsetting moment for both of us that we tackled there and then. And Lee and I in education are making sure that's the same. We will make sure in this new framework that we can do two things. We can recognise the context in which people work and still have high standards. And you can do that by separating out some of the judgments. Right now we only have 4. One of them is, the first one is the quality of education, which in essence looks at the curriculum, the quality of the teaching of that curriculum and the outcomes that children get. And because all of those 3 really important areas are wrapped into one single word judgment, it allows no nuance. So we go into schools where they get dreadful outcomes, but the leaders are doing great work on the curriculum and they're developing their teachers, and it's not lesson observations of any nonsense that was written in the press from anything anybody's been talking about for ages. That's just silliness. We would never go back to that. It's about then separating it and saying, look, you can, as a leader, have a really good, clear curriculum, which might be brought in or developed elsewhere, or it might be your own, and it might be of really high standards, so the very best of the EIF developed by my predecessor, which was important in raising standards in this country. It's an important part of our work, and we'd be daft to drop that. We can then say, how well are you developing your teachers and supporting them to do their job as leaders? And then we can say, and what are your outcomes are like for your school? And I think the beauty of a report card is you can have one judgment that says that's not good enough and that bit's very good. And you can be both, because you're not held by one single word summary judgment trying to describe it all. And that's how I think we can avoid the famous phrase of the soft bigotry of low expectation and still recognise the context in which people work. And I'm really looking forward to, Lee, you describing that work to the system later this month when we go out to consultation. And that's how I think this government and Ofsted will hold the system to higher levels of account than ever before, while still removing that single word.
I appreciate that you are limited in terms of what you can share because we are pre-consultation, but it has been said that report cards will have a separate inclusion for safeguarding and inclusion. What other measures would you like to see included in the report cards? What can you share?
Yeah, so, well, if we may, let's try that. Yeah, let's decide if we can build one right now together.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so, okay. So, well, I did this. Interestingly, I went to a executive meeting of one of the very large leadership trade unions, and I sat in front of 50 or 60 of them, and we did this same exercise. So, when I started the job, I had two clear priorities. One, what we do, and I wanted to make sure that we focused on vulnerable and disadvantaged children. I don't think we've talked about it enough in the past, and I think since the pandemic, and that's one of the things I meant to say, Patrick, also with the changes that have happened in the past and all of the difficulty that has resulted post-pandemic on top of the single-word judgments and all the complexity of the accountability system. That's where a lot of the stress of the systems come from, and the changing services. I mean, you know, when I was a head teacher, I had a social worker, I had an educational psychologist, I had a school-based nurse, I had all of these things around me. None of those three are in that school anymore. So, you know, things have changed, and we have to recognise that those changes are there. And so my next part is focusing on vulnerable and focusing on bringing together the best systems. I mean, this is one of those moments that's like, well, he's just going to say something that's incredibly obvious now. It's so obvious that no one seems to have focused on it for ages. Ofsted inspects 90 to 95,000 people. And yet we report on the performance of each individual. What we don't think enough about is the journey of a child in an area. So as a parent, your child is born, and Yvette, you'll talk about perhaps even pre-birth children's services
Absolutely.
getting involved into them. They then might access early years provision. They might go into care and then be either, definitely under the auspices of children's services. They might go into foster care. They go into an early years setting. They go into infants, juniors, primary. They go into a secondary school. They might access special or alternative provision. They might go to further education. They might go into secure accommodation. Well, Ofsted's there. If you think of the most vulnerable children in England, we're there across all of them, from pre-birth all the way through, even into adulthood. And Ofsted, I think, has a duty to say to parents, what's it like to be a child growing up in an area accessing all of these services? We did this award-winning piece of work on childcare oases and deserts. And here's an unbelievably obvious thing that I wrote in my annual report that I sent to all of you in December. If you look at our most disadvantaged areas educationally in the country, they are early years deserts. If you look at where the higher suspensions take place, they are often registered alternative provision oasis deserts. If you look at special schools as some of the worst outcomes for SEND children, there are often special school deserts. I think it's Ofsted's job, our independence shines here, to say we can see that performance educationally, so standards of behaviour, standards in attendance, standards of mental health and well-being, and we can see all the services that are either there or not there around them. And I think we should say what it's like to be a child in that setting and what it's like to be a child in that area. So my two jobs were vulnerable children and area insights. And I think a report card can lean both into those as well. Then going back to your original question, which I've now waffled on so much I can't barely remember what it was, so apologies.
The safeguarding and inclusion.
Safeguarding and inclusion. So would we all agree that leadership, it always starts with leadership and governance, and you should look at leadership and governance in a setting. So perhaps on a report card we would start by saying leadership and governance. Then that should be reviewed. How well are governors supporting leaders? How well are leaders supporting staff? How well are all of them supporting the children in their setting? So there's one. Then I think the curriculum is important. How well teachers are being developed and trained to deliver that curriculum is important, and the outcomes that children get are important. Do we think behaviour is important? Yes. Do we think that attendance is important? Well, look at post-pandemic at the difficulties on attendance. Right now, we look at behaviour and attitudes, and behaviour and attendance get lumped together as one. But again, I think it's important to say, well, what's behaviour like? What's the behaviour like in the school setting? And what's the behaviour like in lessons? There's behaviour for learning and behaviour in and around the setting. And then you have attendance. So I think it's important that we talk about those. And again, recognise in terms of attendance that sometimes the systems and the things that are affecting schools' attendance are not entirely in the school's gift. It might be the absence of other systems supporting those children all around them. So it's not just raw data, it's about, are you aware as leaders of the issues of attendance? Are you taking effective action? And is it having an impact? So again, being proportionate and looking at that. Then you might want to say, well, how well are children being personally developed? I think that's important. Then, because it's my pet project, and I think this is the one bit I stand guilty of right now, of saying the Chief Inspector is determining something, disadvantaged children matter. I'm a firm believer that if settings get it right for disadvantaged and vulnerable children, they get it right for everyone. I've never seen any setting do a really bang-up job for the most difficult and vulnerable children and do awful for everyone else. It just doesn't happen. So I think we should focus on inclusion and disadvantage, and I think we have a duty here, even though we are independent, to support government in its ambitions for special educational needs children, because the system doesn't work right now. It's a lose-lose situation. It is broken. There are far too many children who are the most vulnerable who aren't getting good enough quality, and I think we can direct schools to be more inclusive and reward those ones who are doing the difficult job. So what have we done? We've just said leadership and governance, curriculum, developing teaching, looking at the outcomes, behaviour, attendance, personal development, inclusion. I think all of those, we're starting to build the complexity and nuance that I think people can talk about in a report card. I just need to make sure that it doesn't drive workload and it's proportionate. And then lastly, safeguarding. I think safeguarding should be separate and not a part of leadership and government management as it is right now, for the reasons we talked about when I was addressing the Chair's first questions, and also because safeguarding is very much a not met judgment. It's very difficult to say safeguarding is outstanding. Well, even in outstanding settings, where good things are happening, bad people can still exist and bad things can still happen, and we've seen that sadly in far too many cases across all of the remits in which we work. So I think that it's a nonsense to try and judge anything other than met, not met, and I think we can be clear. We can take the really difficult tone, which is keeping children safe in education, which is like an inch and a bit thick, and that's a difficult job. It's up every year, it's updated, and the head teacher, if you're a standalone primary head teacher, you've got to try and get through that every year, and even though it summarises what's different, it's still it's still a big requirement. Well, I've tasked Lee with explaining in the new framework what are the key aspects of that we will hold people to account. It's going to be unbelievably obvious what we will inspect on. I don't expect anyone to fail safeguarding because I don't want any children not to be safe anywhere. And again, I think that way of working, Lee, I think we can help the system without overstepping the role. We are not a school improvement, we are a school inspectorate. But we can improve the system by being clear on what are those core aspects. And that's the level of consultation we'll go into. I think we can describe the system and ask people, are we right in what we try to capture? And are we proportionate? And does it still work to parents? Raising standards, making sure that parents can see information. I mean, again, going back, Mark, to your question about trust. If you go around all your constituencies, how many banners are outside providers? Ofsted rating is. How many people celebrate in your local newspapers, in all your constituencies, the Ofsted judgments? We get thousands and thousands. I get far more letters about how well we're doing, or messages or text messages. I've had loads today and yesterday, even for coming here, telling me about the job that we're doing and the transform that we're making, than we do complaints. But I'm not being complacent. One inspection that doesn't go well sends shockwaves through the system, and it has a fear factor for people waiting for the phone call, the dreaded phone call from the inspectorate, and I've got to try and get over that line, but still hold people to account for unacceptable levels, and that bit of it will always exist. I don't know how you can possibly get away from that without removing any level of accountability whatsoever.
Great, Mark, thank you.
Yes,
Thanks.
yeah, and not on that topic, just on the education inspection framework. We know it's going to have to be reformed to facilitate report cards. How long do you estimate that it'll take to inspect all schools under a new system?
Yeah, so, well, currently we're coming to the end of the current cycle of inspections, which is across a 5-year period. Of course, we will be looking to see what that means for a renewed inspection framework. It's difficult, as Martyn has already mentioned in previous answers, about how much funding we are given and what, in terms of the timescale, we can commit to in terms of the volumes of work. But we would want to ensure, across all of our education provision, that parents had timely information about the quality of education and care that their children are receiving, whatever that setting or provider may be, from early years all the way through to further education and skills. What I can't commit to today is what those timescales will look like. Of course, there are some providers that have more vulnerable children than others, and would we want to inspect those more frequently than other places? But again, it's a question that we would need to ask in terms of our spending review commitments, which we know are coming up, in terms of what we can commit to, in terms of what we can then do as inspection volumes for the future. Currently, our position is determined on once, at least, in the duration that a child journeys through their school provision.
It's probably worth just coming in there, Lee, on early years, because currently for the registered provision, so for the youngest children, they get their first inspection after they've registered with us within 30 months. So we haven't seen them without children. Ideally, we'd like to bring that forward, and what Lee and I have worked together on is an inspection regime that's got the regulatory spine that Martyn talks about at the heart of it. So we'd like to bring that forward, and their window is longer than schools. It's currently 6 years, and we think for the youngest children that's too long. So I think it's part of the thinking that we're doing together as a team to make sure that we've got the proportionate response to the separate bits. But as Lee's alluded to, the spending review will play a part in that.
And of course, risk-based in terms of who needs inspection the most. And of course, we have emergency procedures in terms of, Martyn mentioned, the Secretary of State directing us in cases. But equally, if we have concerns, we can inspect without notice. And of course, those schools that need inspection the most in terms of supporting improvement, those currently that we would say requires improvements from some of the aspects or inadequate, obviously receive more inspections through their monitoring activities. So there is a proportionate approach depending on how we've evaluated their provision.
Well, I think in the Act it says that we must inspect within the 6-year cycle. We currently manage a 4-year cycle. Yeah. But again, we want, without denuding our ability to have a spending review conversation and taking on the serious challenges of public finances and the fact that Ofsted, like every other government department, commit to a zero-based budget review of our work to make sure we're doing more with less as we have done for years. Although we will hopefully be leaning into the Labour manifesto commitment to provide 45 million for Ofsted reform going forward. That is something that was music to our ears, of course, to hold the system to account. But again, seriously, we recognise that the system, we shouldn't be first in line for receiving money. If you gave me a choice, I would always put it on the frontline services that are delivering for children, because we don't deliver, we inspect those that deliver. And so, just want to be really clear on that. We currently will have completed an inspection against the EIF, which is a spending review commitment from 2021 by July this year. Now, that took 5 or so years to complete that. So if we were to work in exactly the same time frame, we would beat the 6-year deadline, but it wouldn't be 6 years and it wouldn't be 4, it'd be somewhere in between. So that would be our best guess. But if we have a poor spending review decision, then my only choice as the Chief Inspector is to either lengthen the period between inspections or reduce the size of team.
Yeah, understood.
There is not much else you can do, because all we've done for years, and my predecessor talked about this really articulately to this committee, we've often deprioritised the systems that keep children safe to focus on the actual act of inspecting. And I'm determined that, for example, in your world, you require a new system to help support how we monitor notifications. So in children's services, if something happens, providers have to notify us, and Yvette desperately needs a new system, and I must not deprioritise that, because I think at some point I will be irresponsibly not keeping children safe because I've not done my duty there. So it's a difficult balancing act.
Yes.
But the Treasury and the Department of Education work well with us, and we'll be continuing those really tough conversations in the coming months.
Oh, brilliant. And we'll see what the outcome of the spending review is. And then just very briefly, once the report card system has come in, obviously schools will be inspected. Will all schools retain their one-word judgments until they've been inspected under the new regime?
So no school loses its judgment, but when its judgment then happens and takes place, it will be the new judgment, which is its latest. And on the report card is, well, look, Ofsted has a framework, but the report card is the Department of Education's report card. It's our framework. We will inspect, but our inspections are a point in time. Whether it's every few months, every 4 years, every 6, whatever that period is. But the Department of Education is holding information on those providers more annually, or even sometimes, for example, on attendance, it has regular information. It may, I've no idea, that's for the Department of Education. It can choose to add far more detail to that framework that we have and make an even more nuanced report card. So there's much more that can come, but that's a question for the Secretary of State.
That's right, but they'll retain their one-word judgments essentially until the new report card system.
We won't remove people's judgments.
That's fine. Yep, thank you. Thank you very much.
Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to multi-academy trusts. And before I talk about government pledges, timing and challenges, just want to take a brief step back because I'm aware of timings. But it's linked around you talking around the learning from things that have happened previously. So prior to October 23, there were summary evaluations done, which was in conjunction, in agreement with the department and with the trusts. Obviously, these were stopped. They didn't result in grading, but they did result in exploring the quality, giving recommendations, and a supportive element. I'm just wondering, the take-up, the success of those, how, did you judge them a success? I understand they were stopped so you could continue the statutory ones. But what learning did you get from that that's possibly fed into the potential good practice and the changes in the new framework? Because, was it a success? Was it a success? And was there some learning to take?
Yeah, so thank you. So multi-academy trust summary evaluations, or MATSs as they're referred to in the system. I still think in my old role, I'm still the largest trust to have ever undertaken a MATSI. So I can tell you it from both sides on this one. So it was a voluntary exercise. So I volunteered. So I was asked and I said, yes, I'll undertake it. And they looked at all of the inspections. So I'd had, when I said I've had 100 inspections, I think I'd had, 12, 15 or so inspections in like a 12-month window. And then they took all of the learning from those inspections and they looked at all of the things that they found that were systemic across each of those inspections, and they looked at all the other schools and their predecessor judgments. Then they had a conversation in the centre. I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from that going forward, but it was an unfunded piece of work. It's a luxury Ofsted can't afford to do, and it's something that we didn't have legislation behind it. Now, the Labour Party's made a commitment, the government's made a commitment in its manifesto to launch a consultation into MAT inspections. And I think my answer has always been, it was on appointment at this committee and it still is now, I think Ofsted should look at all groups and all responsible bodies running education, children's services and skills everywhere. So I would say that my desire would be that it's not just multi-academy trusts, but everyone who's responsible. So in the Children's Wellbeing Bill, we're really pleased to see, for example, that we have now, going through, I think, Parliament in its second reading this week, a chance to look at those responsible for running children's homes. I would say the same across all groups, whether it's diocesans, groups, maintained groups, multi-academy groups. We should look wherever anyone is responsible. We should hold them accountable for the decisions that they're making. We have undertaken a public piece of research. My Director of Insights, who's behind me in the audience, is working now with independent groups and people who are joining it to start to look at governance and patterns of governance. We'll work with the system, we'll work with recognised bodies, for example, the Confederation of School Trusts and the trade union representatives, especially the leadership organisations, and we'll develop a framework, whether it's just for MATs or it's for wider groups, which looks at the way we work. Now, I have to say that I have thought about what this might look like, and in designing the framework, with its complexity and nuance. I've tried to think about what that may be in the future, but it is something that we want to consult on, and I've got a lot of work to do in our organisation to try and employ more inspectors of experience like I have as chief executives, executive leaders and head teachers working in such groups, so that we can match our expertise to the expertise of the people in the system. But I think it's a worthwhile, I think it's a good exercise, because no one should be able to hide anywhere in any shadow and not be within the view of the inspectorate and regulator where they're responsible for children. We should hold them to account.
Thank you. And just on that, actually, so obviously, one of the first questions would be, when will we expect, do we think the first multi-academy trust inspection might take place? But before you answer that, I'd like to think about what are the biggest challenges for Ofsted when it comes to inspecting multi-academy trusts, and what steps have you taken? You thought about that in the framework, but what steps have you taken to mitigate those challenges?
Well, first of all, it requires, I think, it will require an act. We will need a legal basis. A voluntary MATSI, it won't cut it. That's not going to be appropriate. So my time frame will back over to you when it goes in front of the House, when it passes through you. Whether it would come here first or go straight to the House, that's not my area of expertise. I'll leave that to others. So I should be beholden upon that act and what you decide, and our then ability to deliver. There's another example of Ofsted. We will independently go and deliver the act. We will find what we find, and no one will tell us what we will find, but we will not adhere to what the law is that you pass on how we should go about performing that piece of work. Now, on what we learn, again, I think I might be. I'm certainly going to there's a saying, isn't there, that success has many parents, but failure is an orphan. Well, I'm definitely one of the original people that said this. The school is the trust, and the trust is the school. In my old organisation, when people said, "What do you mean? What's it like to work for the trust?" I would say, "What do you mean? The school is the trust is the school. We're indivisible. It's a nonsense to think you can inspect the school and the trust as separate entities." But I do think, let's imagine, let's go back to Serena's question. Let's say that you've got a trust, Amanda, with 20 schools in it. And let's say that in those 20 schools, we pick one, I don't know, the curriculum or attendance. Let's say in 20 occasions out of 20, we find that attendance or the curriculum was not being well run in those individual schools. I think there's a chance that it's worthwhile then having a conversation with the central body and saying, well, look, you've got a systemic issue here across all of your schools where this same problem's coming up time and time again. What as an organisation are you doing to support those individual schools in those matters there? Because what it shouldn't be is an additional burden for one part of the system that another part of the system doesn't face. That I'm conscious of. My whole life, whether it's vulnerable children, it's equity and fairness. What really upsets me is when it's just not fair. And so having a system where maintained schools have a different type of inspection to a trust, that bothers me a lot. Making sure that we don't suddenly say that we're going to inspect the trust as if it exists, but the school inspections are something else, that bothers me. I think if you're a parent, most of I think, what did 41, 42 schools, I don't think parents gave an absolute jot about the trust. All they cared about was their child's primary, their child's secondary. I still think we need to make sure that parents know what it's like to go to that school. I think we'll manage all of that, and hopefully I'll get a chance to try and influence what the law looks like as you pass it in Parliament, and we get a chance to test it from the research that we should present and the systems and the conversations we'll have with the system, the best learning that takes place. But I still think it's right that every group, children's homes, nurseries, secure accommodation, foster care agencies, schools, trusts, maintained dioceses, I think every group should be responsible to us, ultimately therefore to Parliament, for the work that they get, because they receive millions, billions in total of taxpayers' money, and I think it's right that they should account for it.
Thank you, Chair. The government has said it will introduce annual safeguarding reviews for every school in England. What discussions have you had with the department about whether Ofsted or another body will be carrying out these reviews?
So they're not very, thank you, they're not very advanced conversations. I mean, at the end of the day, it's been a very busy period, hasn't it? Both between me starting in January and all of the reforms, and I've not even touched the surface on the amount of changes that I've made to Ofsted in the last 12 months, or I'm about to make in the next 12 months. But a moment to the Secretary of State here, and the fact that she's had a very busy period since July through to December, and trying to deliver an entire manifesto in basis of just an autumn is probably not very wise. So we haven't had a great deal of discussions, but we have been clear that it's a sensible thing to do to have a separate safeguarding judgment, in which case Ofsted can and will carry on holding schools accountable as we do now under the EIF, and we will separately under the report card if that's what comes out of the consultation. It's not a fait accompli, the consultation. We'll listen to the feedback, we'll take on board challenge and criticism, and we'll make changes where we need to based upon that. So we will endure in holding people to account for keeping children safe, a critical job that we do. And that can last for as long as it then requires. If then there is a requirement to produce annual safeguarding, well, we can then quite easily decouple that from our inspection framework and move it into that annual piece of work. Whether that's a piece of work which is ours or whether it belongs to anyone else, my opinion, which I've not had any in-depth conversation with the Secretary of State about, would be this. Ofsted is independent, as we talked about with Mark. Even with a local authority children's safeguarding board, remembering that local authorities have maintained schools and relationships with all of their schools, even they couldn't have that level of independence that Ofsted has by saying we will make a judgment on safeguarding whether it's effective or not, because they really would be marking their own homework. It'd be the organisation responsible for children's safeguarding in their local authority that's then asking how well children are being kept safe in their own local authority. So I think there has to be a level of independence, and I think we have the expertise. I mean, the expertise that I have, that Lee has, that your huge army and the vast array of expertise in His Majesty's inspectorates, but then Yvette, all of your experience as a Director of Children's Services and all the social workers that you have between us who've worked on children's safeguarding boards, I think together we can provide something that's really, really robust. And here's an interesting fact. I mentioned the 45 million in the Labour manifesto. If we were to send an Ofsted inspection team into every school every single year, guess how much it would cost? 45 million a year. Now, I've no idea whether that's the figure from the manifesto that came about, but it's really expensive. And in a tightening public finances, I think it's right that we ask ourselves, is this the best spending of the money? If you said to me now, do you think children's safeguarding in schools is the burning bush? My answer would be no. We do not see safeguarding as the biggest issue in schools. I would say that by far placing the needs of special educational needs children is a much bigger issue in schools than it is to look at annual safeguarding. I think we have got quite robust systems in place now. Bad things happen, and I'm not sure that they still wouldn't even in an annual safeguarding review. So I'm looking forward to the conversation when it comes, and we'll have a challenging conversation, and ultimately we'll make sure we adhere to the law.
Thank you. It's me again. You touched on the Ofsted Academy in your sort of overview of the 1 to 6, and the predecessor committee inquiry into Ofsted's work heard from concerns around the lack of relevant expertise among inspectors. So I've got two questions around that. How will the proposed academy improve this? And secondly, do you intend to implement the previous committee's recommendations that Ofsted publish data on inspectors' expertise and ensure that at a minimum the leader always has experience of the relevant type of school they're inspecting?
Almost yes to almost everything you just said. No in one aspect, and I'll try to describe that. So the Ofsted Academy was to make sure we had, as I said, rather than 8 regions, we had central fidelity to Yvette's and to Lee's direction as the national directors of policy on the way that training takes place. But also to make sure, I mean, when I was a teacher, quite a number of you on here say you've been previously teachers, you'll remember that you had PPA time, 10%. I used to give my staff 12.5%, not 10% PPA time. And I was trying to think to myself, my inspectors are really busy. I mean, they work long hours. It's difficult week inspecting. It's, I'm really conscious of their workload, not just the workload of leaders, but staff and the consequence it has on them. I wanted to think about how can I develop our own version of PPA time inside. So instead of going to training, you train HMIs far more regularly, but you have basically for inspectors 2 big events in the year, one at the start in September, one in January. Well, that's a bit like inset days in schools. You're lurching from one inset day, a term may go by, and then you have another. I didn't used to like that when I used to run schools, so I used to disaggregate inset days and turn it from 5 a year. I used to keep 2 and disaggregate 3 and turn it into weekly training of 2 hours. Because we know the way children learn, it's about continual repetition of information and revisiting it and then building upon that going forward. Well, the same happens for adults. I wanted them to be training all of the time. So every Friday now, for example, if we do a Monday notification, so this is the beauty of a Monday notification, which has made a big difference to the system, and it's a fairly obvious thing to do, and it came from my experience. It came from, actually, the head teacher who took after me of a large, then outstanding school, it's a good school now, in Wakefield with 2,200 children. He used to live in Sheffield and drive all the way to Wakefield, and he used to put his suit in the car on the Monday and not take it out of his car until the Wednesday night, just in case he had the phone call from Ofsted. And I thought to myself, that's, doing that for years because he was waiting as an outstanding legacy school for an inspection, it's just ridiculous. So by doing a Monday notification, I can make sure that people know on a Monday, by Monday afternoon, if we're coming that week or not, for a routine inspection. Not an emergency, we'll go whenever we feel we need to for those, or for monitoring inspections where it's an enduring relationship, that's different. So by having that level of relationship, we knew that Monday notification meant a Tuesday, Wednesday inspection, Thursday was to write the report and to deal with it, and then Friday would create free time for them to start focusing on training and consistency. And so the Ofsted Academy can do an awful lot there to really focus on complaints, consistency, and all of the work. But on top of that, we can also then look at the expertise. So one of the recommendations from the predecessor committee was to look at the expertise. So I'd already decided to do this in discussion thankfully, the select committee's recommendations chimed with a lot of things I said on my pre-appointment hearing. For example, I said the big listen, and the recommendation was do the big listen. And I said also, I think, that we would have a look at the expertise of inspectors. So I've launched a large survey across all of our employed staff, and then I shall do the same across all of our Ofsted inspectors. Remembering a couple of thousand of them are working in schools and early years providers right now. Well, look at their expertise, and then I will endeavour to match the expertise of them against settings. So a special school from special school expertise, and that's a real ambition I have. I would hate to denude the lead inspector by saying they would have the experience. His Majesty's inspectorates, our lead Ofsted inspectors, they're going into, it could be as many as 30, 35 settings a year. They develop an incredible bank of expertise. I don't think it's necessary to say that the lead inspector should come from the setting that is being inspected. I do think it would be ideal if they did. I think it's essential that I move towards a system where people on the team come from the setting. To do that overnight would be unrealistic and would require, it just wouldn't be achievable in changing my workforce that fast. But it is a commitment that I've got, and I will report on it. And one of the hubs one of the external reference groups, I created 2. One on insights and evidence for education, and another insights and evidence for social care. And I have experts, for example, some of the people that have written about this, John Jerem, Dr. Sam Sims, they've written about this problem. Well, John's on that reference group. And I deliberately did that because I said, I want to make sure that you're getting the information from us as academics where you can hold us to account and you can hold us and to our level of openness and transparency, because if they can show me something that we can do better, then I should not be defensive about it. I should say, just tell me and I'll do better. And that's the way I intend to work.
Thank you, Chair. Let's turn to special educational needs, which you've rightly identified as the most pressing issue on all fronts at the moment. You said a moment ago that Ofsted should want any of the settings that you're inspecting to be taking the most vulnerable children, and that you should be judging that accordingly. The predecessor committee found that that's not the case, and that Ofsted does not sufficiently take account of the challenges that are currently being faced. So, with respect to the new inclusion criterion that you're going to be introducing, could you say a bit about how you envisage that working to ensure that Ofsted does properly account for that in early years in schools and in other settings too?
Yeah, well, I'll also invite Yvette and Lee to come in on both this point as well. So the first thing that we did was to go and get, because it's a really contested point, what do you mean by inclusion or disadvantaged? Even on SEND, people conflate children with an educational healthcare plan to those who've been identified as school action, K-code, SEND, and suddenly people no longer know what we're actually talking about. So we went out and conducted a piece of research. My Director of Insights behind me again conducted a piece of research, and it was won by Des Holmes, who was research in practice and is now part of the National Children's Bureau. And they're conducting a piece of research and what we mean by the definition of disadvantage. Now, I deliberately used the word vulnerable when I started in the role because I didn't want people to fall into the trap of thinking disadvantage meant purely pupil premium. Because disadvantage could be anything. It could be, I mean, I'm really concerned about the sheer number of young carers in the system. It really bothers me if you think about early years, the point that you made. I mean, in truth, if you've not made a good level of development at the age of 5, you could describe anybody who's therefore not at GLD as potentially disadvantaged. But we know from the EEF and Sutton Trust and others like EPI that the real comorbidity, if you like, of being socially, economically disadvantaged and not making a good level of development, socially, economically disadvantaged and being a young carer, it's always coming back to, we find, socially, economically disadvantaged is a huge part of that. So we want to look at inclusion, capturing all of those aspects. I had a text message just on Sunday night from a primary head teacher who's written an article in one of the trade press saying, you know, have you read my article? And he sent me a direct message. And so I read it, and in it I think he described what you're describing, Darren. He said he's in the primary school head teacher. I think he said he had, I'll try and remember this, 8 children and an educational healthcare plan in one class. Well, if I don't know what it's got, I didn't look at his school, but if he's got a class of, 30 children and 8 of them have got an EHCP, it might be that they're all going to perform exceptionally well, or it might be that 8 children all miss the expected standard, but it can have a huge impact. And he was saying, look, if I've taken these 8 children in my school, if I now don't get the expected standard, because I've taken these 8 children and their needs won't allow them to help me get that standard, they're working below the standard, I shouldn't be penalised by it. And he's saying, what are you going to do about that? And so we had a conversation, and he was really thankful of the plans. And I was saying, we want to recognise an inclusion that you're doing that piece of work. But we're about raising standards. At the same time, I can still say your outcomes for everybody else is X, but your work on inclusion is Y. And X and Y don't have to be the same. And that's the beauty of a report card and not having a single word judgment. That's the complexity, that's the nuance that we can get into. Do you want to touch further on, do you want to carry further on special educational needs and area send? Should we go, do you want to talk about that?
I think time allows.
So if you're happy to wrap your question up with this section, Mark, then and allow Sir Martyn to talk about area inspections.
Oh, absolutely.
Now, and then come in with any follow-ups that you'd like to ask.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fine. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry.
It's
my
You're referring to my follow-ups.
Yeah. Are you happy, Umbrella, with that approach?
I apologise, Chair.
Sorry. Are you happy if we allow Sir Martyn now to talk about area inspections, and then you can come in with any follow-up questions that you want to? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, do you want to talk about area send inspections, Yvette?
I can. Lee may also want to chip in. Martyn's also talked about area insights, and one of the things that Lee and I are really conscious of, that we can have a situation where all of the schools we visited recently are outstanding. They've got children with SEND, and then the locality is not making progress, and there are real challenges. So we need to both strengthen, and Lee is, the inclusion issue in the core school inspection framework, but also join the dots across those things. And I think, local areas are struggling with the concept of the local authorities are struggling with the concept of them being held to account for the breadth of the education system, some of which they've got influence but not direct, but also very particularly the health economy. So we also think that a report card can hold the right people to account for the right things. So you will see in many of the SEND reports, and I know predecessor committees and yourselves have all raised concerns about the access to CAMS, the assessment by health of children with specific needs, without the assessment getting the right support, etc. And Martyn has also talked about the team around the school and the ability of a school to get those right support services for children. So we think the combination of firstly starting with the EIF, and you'll see that very, very soon, but then also refreshing our SEND, so we're taking stock at the minute, aren't we, Lee? And then we need to think about how that system refreshes to join those dots more effectively.
So that's the beauty. Sorry,
I was just going to add, one of the criticisms we often receive is how can you be so positive, as Yvette mentioned, on your individual school inspections about SEND, yet local areas are systemic failings as one of our judgment areas. And that's because, from my experience as one of His Majesty's inspectors, which I forgot to mention in my bio at the beginning, the vast majority of head teachers want to do the absolute best for the children in their care, including those with SEND. And what we're increasingly seeing is that head teachers are doing everything they can, including using their own budget, education budget, to fund, for example, speech and language therapy for the youngest children, which is actually part of health and a health budget. So what we do on individual inspection is credit where head teachers are going above and beyond and doing everything they can, but in our local area inspection, rightly saying, but that's not right, is it? Because they're doing things that they shouldn't have to do within the wider system to account for, we all know it, a lack of funding in terms of SEND. So Martyn and Yvette are right, we will try to ensure that the inclusion aspect of a report card moving forward absolutely tries to get underneath this, including that best start in life, because all the data tells us that once those gaps emerge from the age of 3, they do not narrow. In fact, they widen as children move across education. So I'm delighted that the Secretary of State is prioritising early education and getting it right at the first steps. And of course, we'll continue to review our approach to area send as well, to get that nuance that we expect across our education provision too.
I mean, if you go back to Serena's question about a report card, you can just easily imagine, I think, a report card for area send where you say, well, let's look at education, let's look at health, let's look at care, let's look at the leadership of all of those systems coming together. And I would suspect that we would find systemic failings in health. And then, as our inspectorate, we can report on the individual, and then we can report on systemic failings. And that's where our independence comes in, because then at that point I'll stand up and say to government, what are you doing about this? Because you can't have 153 local authorities with the vast majority of them failing and not say this is now a systemic issue for England. That's over to you now. You've now got to take some responsibility in how we sort this out. I mean, I think we've completed 38 area send inspections so far. We've had 12 systemic failings for area send, 16 have been inconsistent and 10 typically positive. So 153 local authorities, that's 38, 12 systemic failings, 16 inconsistent practice. There are only 7 out of the 38 that are typically positive and outstanding in their ILACs. Now, that means that as a nation, we're saying that at the moment local authorities are really failing to deliver across the system, and yet we know that we have very, very experienced, very well committed, excellent directors of children's services who are out there trying their level best. We've got to be really careful. Ofsted can cause all sorts of unintended consequences. I mean, I'm asking you, but it's really worth, I think, me touching upon this. Just I'll be quick, Chair. If you look at unregistered and illegal children's homes, for example, it'd be quite easy for Ofsted to just say, we'll hold everyone to account who uses them. But we need to make sure that, bearing in mind, often, not always, but often local authorities have been to a court to get permission from a court to actually place a child in one of those settings, that we don't create a situation where the local authority now will have not have any oversight of those children. What's the alternative? That they go homeless? If there's literally nowhere to place them, it's Ofsted's job to say there is insufficient registered provision in this area for the demand that's being placed. And again, whether that's a local authority issue or that's an issue for government and Ofsted's calling it out, that's where our independence will stand strong. And that's what I think our new report cards in ILACs and in the SCIF and in Area Send can get stronger and have more bite and yet be fair. Fair to those people on the ground and not cause unintended consequences for the children out there.
Manuela, did you have any follow-up on area inspections?
Yes, obviously according to Ofsted's most recent report, as you mentioned, there are inconsistencies and weaknesses across local area partnerships in their delivery for service for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. So can you elaborate more on those? I mean, you touch on some, so health, for example, and access to CAMS and so on, but could you elaborate on those?
Yeah, I think it's just because of the complex nature of that work. You know, local areas, it's not only local authority in terms of education and care, but there are integrated care boards in terms of health, and how do those two entities interact with each other, and then through inspection, how do we hold those entities to account, and not, as Martyn has said, wanting to disproportionately hold one of those more to account than another, particularly where we know some of the challenges exist. So I think there is something about joint commissioning. How do those two bodies work together? There's something about governance and oversight, and I think, although we're still in the process of reviewing how we approach Area Send after, I think it's about 18 months of this inspection framework, there is something about a report card that would allow us to get the same nuance, that would be able to direct us better to where improvement is needed and where the strengths exist.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we're really mindful of is that we're going into local authorities and saying, you haven't got the right continuum of offer. We're saying to health that the assessment, waiting lists and delivery are very poor. The same local authority is in a recovery conversation with the Treasury and the Department for Local Government to recover and reduce their spend on SEND in the next 5 years. So what is their priority, reducing spend or improving services? And of course, one can spend your money better. But those two things in parallel really stick in the claw of local authorities, and we're getting the grief of that on our local inspection. We can take that. We're trying to find a method of reporting that more fairly, as Martyn says, reflects that. But that is the national systemic issue that has to be addressed.
I suppose really fastly say, where of the 7 that I said where we saw both typically positive and outstanding or good ILACs inspections, what did we notice? Well, we noticed that their partnership working was the best in the country. And again, I go back to what I said about area insights. We want to encourage partnership working. We want to encourage the system talking to each other, supporting each other and helping each other, because we know every time that they do that, we get the best provision for children in England. And so that's the part Ofsted can help nudge the system in that direction.
And just one very
briefly.
The partnership working. So it's the very small amount of area send inspections that were positive. Is there a way for them to share that best practice with others and learn?
And they do share through the ADCS group and the way that they work in Solace and all the other groups. Yeah. They have because there was only 153 local authorities, it's a very tight network of directors of children's services. And Yvette and I mean, of all the groups that exist, of the 95,000 people held accountable, I think I must have seen nearly, I'm going to say, 100 of the 153 DCSs in person in the last year. So we have long conversations. But another huge part of Amanda's question of the Ofsted Academy, one of the things that we can do with a report card is we can also be the conduit to say where we find the best practice, rather than Ofsted writing up that best practice. My proposal would be to say to providers, if you wish, won't make them, can't make them. But if you want to share your best practice that we find nationally, then through our Ofsted Academy, it can be the best practice function library where we can point one part of the country to the other and we can hold the very best practice for people to learn from. So that's another big part of the work. If you're going to check people's consistency, you might as well also celebrate the outstanding and work that way as well. And again, it's a really important part of Ofsted not crossing the line of telling people how to improve. We are saying we've seen great practice, we're letting the system talk to itself, and we're just the conduit to help. We are of the system, by the system, for parents and children. I'm really clear on not crossing that line.
And back on unregistered children's homes, which you just mentioned, obviously we've got the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill that proposes to give Ofsted the power to fine those who operate unregistered children's homes. What's your view on whether those powers go far enough to help Ofsted deal with the problem of unregistered children's homes?
I'll take that, Martyn. Thank you. We've obviously been working very closely with DfE officials, helping them refine their thinking and their powers that we've asked for. We think they're really helpful. We've got a very tiny team working together, looking at the investigation of homes and the prosecution of homes. And I think 3 years ago, when we started doing that and we funded it, we were anticipating 300 a year. We're well in excess of 1,000, and that was validated in the Office for the Children's Commissioner's recent report that Martyn and she agreed that she would undertake. So we've done a lot to strengthen our approach, issuing warning letters, working with local authorities who sometimes inadvertently use an unregistered children's home, so we inform them, we inform all local authorities. We've conducted, I think, we're on our third criminal investigation, and only one of them has reached the threshold for prosecution, and that's coming into court. What we've learnt is this takes an extraordinary amount of time. Whereas Martyn says 65% of these children are placed by the court, it is hard to tackle a criminal prosecution because essentially it's the state versus the state. So that avenue is costly, time-consuming, and we focused our energy on moving the children, working with local authorities to get them to a better place. But we do think fining as another tool may also help in the system. But going back to what Martyn says, the systemic issue of having the right number of children, places for children in the right place, and going back to the children on doles, of which there are an extraordinary number, there's been a commensurate reduction in inpatient mental health care for children with the increase of children who are now placed on doles in the community. And what the system, collectively, health, education and care, haven't done is commissioned good, local, community-based provision for those children. So bespoke placements without the line of sight is not the right option. We think that the fines are part of it, but we have to do all of those things. Absolutely all of those things, including holding local authorities to account for their oversight, for using them very, very rarely, and for moving the children on as swiftly as they can.
So they are, you're saying, a tool that will help you, but the wider context of sufficiency and capacity is...
We need all of those things in our response.
Okay, no, that's helpful, thank you.
In the annual review, we talked about 25% of children's homes, for example, in the northwest, but that far outstrips demand, and there aren't sufficient... There are far more children in London and far fewer homes, and yet there are far more homes and far fewer children in the northwest. we're just moving children from one part of the country to the other, which then places further pressure on the use of unregistered provision. We've got to get that bit right. Ofsted's got a duty here. Obviously, we never identify where children's homes are on reports, but we have that information and we need to start using that work far more. And we also know that roughly 80% of children's homes are privately owned, and that over a quarter of all homes are owned by the 10 largest group operators. And we don't have any problem, and the system doesn't have any problem with profit being made by people in the system. We have a huge problem, though, of profiteering. And equally, we want to have a say and call that out. And so any aspect of the Children's Wellbeing Bill which focuses on that, we would welcome.
Group ownership, the opportunity to work with local areas to turn down children's homes, because we've actually got 2021-22 we had 2,500 children's homes. We've now got 3,500. Are they run by the right people, meeting the right needs in the right places? So the planning changes. I think there's a whole range of things in the bill that we really welcome.
If you go to the context, if you place in the northwest, if I just choose two areas, Blackpool or Knowsley, doing good work in both areas, but if you look at the educational outcomes, you look at the early years deserts that exist in those areas, and then what do? Place more children who are the most vulnerable in children's homes in exactly the places that are facing these biggest challenges. Frankly, that's the definition of madness, and Ofsted needs to call it out.
Thank you. Final question from me. On registered children's homes, we've got an almost comparable problem to schools accepting more SEND children and then being penalised by the inspection and the judgment system. The independent review of children's social care found that there are registered homes where they can meet their needs, but they're reluctant to do so because they think there's going to be a negative impact on their Ofsted rating. So what's your response to that? How do we get past that impasse? Because that's not good for primarily the children, but the system more widely.
No, it's not. And so one of the examples, Yvette and I went to the National Children's Home Conference, sat on the stage, took questions and tackled these problems straight on. Yvette will carry on the sentence from me here. What we have to be careful is, yes, we must never allow people to use Ofsted as an excuse not to take vulnerable children, but neither must we allow vulnerable children to be placed in settings where they don't have the skill set to look after them. And I have to say that sometimes people conflate those two. They will say to us, we can't take the most vulnerable children, but actually you don't have the skill set in your regulatory manager, the person in charge, to meet the needs of the children that you're taking on. And so we have a duty there to still raise standards and call out that practice, but we definitely do not want people to avoid just because of us. Avoiding because they can't meet their needs, well, bad but good, if you understand me. Avoiding it because of us, unacceptable.
So we've been tackling that perception head on. If you look at the grade profile, actually, those with the most complex needs have got the same outcomes in terms of grade profile. But it is a perception, it's a real one. I think that homes say to the local authority, we're worried about Ofsted. What they say to us is we haven't got the staff to meet their needs. That is, I think there's a workforce issue. And going back to the children in unregistered children's homes, the level of complexity and need, particularly the need for mental health services, is causing some of this perception. Can we meet the needs of these children? The home might not be on their own, but wrapping those services might. I'm really optimistic as well in the bill for the new type of children's home that's between secure and a standard children's home, not that there is a standard children's home. And we're absolutely up for registering that and working with CQC to wrap the right support around those children. And we think if the continuum of offer changes, then the confidence of the sector to take. But I'm still doing work with all my inspectors to make sure that when they're talking about the challenges of meeting individual children, it's done in a strengths-based way and what the setting is doing, not colluding with the concept that these children are too difficult to support.
Yeah, I don't want to be quick. I don't want to overpresent our position here or the confidence here, because we still have a problem, Darren. We've got to deal with this. The DCS, if I try and accurately describe what the Directors of Children's Services would say to Yvette and I, when they take the most complex children with the most vulnerable, then if Ofsted turn up and we see complex children with very vulnerable needs, they're saying, well, these children are displaying difficulties, and what you can't see are the children that we've worked with for years and years and years, and now they might have left our setting, and as a result of this enduring work we've done with them, you somehow need to inspect the product at the end of all that great work rather than that moment in time of the inspection. That is a challenge for us. That is a genuine piece of work that we've got to do more work, more thinking. How can we go into a setting and say, yeah, we can see this isn't right, but we can see that you understand it. How much faith do we take that it will get better for this child years from now, as opposed to what we're seeing today? There is more that we need to do. There are more challenges that we need to have with each other. I don't want to give you an impression that we've got an answer to that. That's a difficult part of our job, but I'm determined to try and find an answer.
Thank you. We'll pick that up in 6 months.
Please.
Thank you. Jess.
I know we're really short of time, so 2 very quick questions. Inspections of supported accommodation providers were postponed from April until September 2024 due to the high volume of registration applications. How many providers have Ofsted inspected so far?
So we've inspected half a dozen. We expect to do 50 by March. We've continued to focus on the registrations because they have children there and we haven't seen them. So we're keeping that careful balance. If you're asking what we're finding a level of complexity. So the supported accommodation was never meant to be for every 16 and 17-year-old. There will be some children whose needs are so complex that they probably need enduring care. And one of the examples Martyn gave earlier was a child placed in supported accommodation whose needs fast outstripped what supported accommodation could realistically provide, and it was an absolutely rubbish piece of provision as well. So there is still work to do about children's homes, fostering, the sorts of homes that we're talking about, the whole continuum. But I think it's a really important step forward for Ofsted in having that line of sight of the whole continuum of offer, and I think we'll be joining the dots and making lots of comments on that in the future.
We expect to do 500 a year once we've gotten over the registration, but that is our priority first.
Thank you. The proposed frequency of supported accommodation inspections has been criticised. Why are inspections of supported accommodation less frequent than those of children's homes, especially when serious weaknesses are found?
So if serious weaknesses are found, if there are regulatory concerns, we can get in at any point in time. We didn't stop doing that even during COVID. We had our boots on the ground and we were looking at the needs of children the whole time. Supported accommodation is supposedly for children who are ready and and able for independence. And so we propose something that's proportionate to that. I think we're probably conflating 2 issues. If we're seeing that the wrong children are there or the wrong providers are making the provision, then that's a matter for us holding the local authority to account for the placement. That's a matter for us holding that provider for taking children that it's not equipped to take. So we're conflating a number of issues there. I think as we inspect more, as we regulate more, we'll be able to provide our insights on those more systemic problems and help the policymakers make the right decisions for the continuum of care.
But I must very quickly say that I'm very proud of the framework that Yvette's team developed for supported accommodation, because it involved so many children who are care experienced and care leavers. They helped us to design this framework, and a really interesting one. We gave them a choice on a continuum. We said, should we do no notice inspections, 1 day, 2 days, up to 2 weeks? We gave them a line, and every care leaver said no notice. Now, interestingly, providers obviously need some notice to make sure that they're there when we turn up. But it's a difference between the provider and those that we inspect for, parents and children. And our job is to try and find the balance, but to raise standards for all.
I'm sure some of those children also told you that their conditions can fluctuate while they're in that supported accommodation as well. So they may be independent at the start, but perhaps things happen where their independence is challenged.
Absolutely. The children's journey is not a continuum, is it? There will be crises and how you respond to those crises, which gets back to the complexity issue as well. Obviously, because we are the regulator, we can go in at any time. Whistleblowing concerns, complaints from children, we will look at the patterns in that, and particularly if we get our new system to look at the notifications more comprehensively. So absolutely take your point. And of course, as we're refreshing all our frameworks, it's an opportunity to look at frequencies. Some of those come back to spending review considerations.
Thank you. You've spoken quite a bit this morning about the very inconsistent level of performance in across local authorities, children's services departments, and the unacceptably high number of local authorities that aren't performing well enough in relation to the children that they're responsible for at the moment. And we've seen just in recent weeks the conviction in the murder of Sarah Sharif as the latest in a series of appallingly tragic cases of children who have died at the hands of people who should have been protecting them. Can you say something about the role of Ofsted in what we all want to see, which is the prevention of those tragedies, any similar tragedies happening again in the future?
Absolutely. So when I started in 2018, we inherited an appalling profile of local authorities, and whilst I robustly hold them to account, and we've got a standard distribution profile, so we're still holding them robustly to account, I take my hat off to the improvements that they've made over time. This is from consistent leadership, a focus on children, proper models, giving social workers enough time to do the job well. And we're now at the place where we've got 31 outstanding local authorities. I think that was the sort of number we had inadequacy in 2018, so it's been a real turnaround. But we all know, don't we, committee members, that bad things happen to children. We can plot through our inspections, them creating the environment, the containing environment for social workers to do the best work where those basics mean that some of these things are less likely to happen. Surrey was sitting on a judgment of inadequacy for 10 years. They had a very experienced DCS come round and take the turnaround, and then sadly they passed, and Rachel Wardell took up the mantle, and we judged them as requiring improvement to be good. So I won't stand here and say they didn't have difficulties, they had struggles around all sorts of things. I think what I'm optimistic in the bill is that some of the systemic issues that local authorities need help with to support that. So the unique identifier, we've got children turning up in all sorts of places and people can't join the dots. That will be really important. The multi-agency child protection teams having health education and police colleagues speaking the same language, joining the dots. That doesn't change what's going on out there in health and the wider police. And we still see, we work very closely with our partner police inspectorate, we still see victim blaming occasionally in the police. I'm really pleased that we're working with Manchester local authorities to look at work with the police, and we've just joined Andy Cook on his inspection, his child protection inspection of Manchester Police. So we at Ofsted are joining the dots with our partner inspectors to look at those partnership arrangements. I think I'm hopeful that there are many measures in the bill which will help make the system issues. We can never prevent people. If we look at Daniel Palkov, if we look at Sarah, I can't comment on that. The review is undergoing. But if you look at those cases, if you look at Arthur, COVID, elective home education, we're really pleased with the elective home education, which I know members of this committee, taking your children out of sight, disguised compliance. All of those issues, there will be a very small number of parents who avoid the line of sight. The more the multi-agency partnership can wrap around schools, wrap around local authorities, the more chance we have of spotting those 1 in a million cases that require the judgment of Solomon and the best information sharing across the partnership.
And just finally, we've spoken a lot about the Children's Wellbeing in Schools bill, which we'll be debating tomorrow in the House of Commons for the second reading. And you've said some things about the things that you welcome in the bill. You've also expressed, I think, a kind of degree of... you've made some comments that imply a lack of engagement and that there might be views that you have that you know haven't been expressed or you haven't taken on board? Are there specific powers that you've asked for that are additional to your current powers that are not in the bill? Is there anything you'd like to tell the committee about the bill ahead of the second reading tomorrow?
Maybe to touch upon the ability. I mean, we now have hopeful that the bill will give us greater powers to go into illegal schools, but still the burden and threshold for prosecution and the resource base in requiring to do that is really difficult.
Yes, so we largely welcome what the bill is putting forward. We've campaigned long and hard for many of the measures for 9 years or more. Martyn's right, some of the fine detail around, yes, we would like a warrant to do our unregistered schools work so we can gather evidence and have more successful prosecutions. But to go through that process requires extra resource and cost to go through the securing a warrant to be able to do it. And of course, we look forward to having more conversations about unregistered alternative provision, which doesn't get as much of a mention in the bill. And how do we? I think it's 20,000 unregistered AP that we would need to have greater oversight of too.
And on the social care side, the predecessor committee I came to talk to about Hesley, I still worry that our ambitions, national minimum standards of care, I mean, what does that say to children? I'd like us to think about being more ambitious in our standards for care. And I do think that across SEND and social care reform, the children with complex disabilities, there needs to be more join up between health and social care and between CQC and Ofsted. We do inspect alongside. There's more work to be done to get the right standards and the right environment for those children to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving your evidence this morning. We look forward to our ongoing relationship of accountability. Order. That brings our proceedings to an end this morning. Thank you.